Have you ever lost patience, waiting for something to be done or someone to arrive, and so you take over and decide you're going to do it yourself, only to realise, big mistake, I should have waited. It would have cost less, ultimately, it would have hurt a lot less, if only you'd waited for the one to come who had all the expertise, all the power to do it right, the professional. There are literally millions of messes, fortunately many of them posted online, of people who should have waited. People who should not have taken matters into their own hands when it came to their DIY deliverance. We're talking about faith over these weeks, and we began last week by considering the whole of faith found in Hebrews chapter 11, the faith chapter. We read in the first 3 verses, "Now faith is the reality of what is hoped for, and the proof of what is not seen. For by this our ancestors were approved." What does it mean that our ancestors were approved by faith? Does it mean it was so strong a faith, impeccable faith, that they could be approved outside or apart from Christ simply by their faith? No. It means that these ancestors, many of whom are mentioned in this Hall of Faith chapter, had witness given to them about their faith. And the witness was God. God bore witness to their faith, and He granted them His divine approval. God approves faith because it pleases Him. We read in verse 6 of this chapter, "Without faith, it is impossible to please God, since the one who draws near to Him must believe that He exists and that He rewards those who seek Him." So we get a clue here in verse 6 about the approval that God gave our ancestors, don't we? That this faith in view in verse 1, this faith that is actually a reality or an assurance of future things to come, which are God's promises, and are the proof or the conviction that the invisible God is currently and always working through even sometimes unseen circumstances. That's what God approves of. It's called faith. It pleases God. Without it, we can't please God. No religious endeavour, accomplishment, reward, or any act is going to please God outside of faith. Be careful of religion. People of faith, verse 6 tells us, they draw near to God. They don't draw back. The previous chapter talks about people drawing back. They're destroyed. Those who have faith draw near. And ultimately believe that He is faithful. That's what our faith is based on. The fact that our God is faithful. It's a beautiful relationship. Are we people of faith? We might look around this community of God, this faith community called church, and say, yes, we're a believing church. I've seen amazing things. I believe we can do anything. We are people of faith. But let me isolate you. It's an important question. Are you a person of faith? You know who you are. You're you. Ask yourself, not the room, not the church, am I a person of faith? Do I believe God exists? Never ceases to amaze me how consistently I ask Christians and press them on their beliefs and what they're standing on to find out they're almost unsure whether God exists. Christians. It's shocking if you actually press. Do I believe God exists? Do I believe God rewards those who seek Him? That's the second thing of pleasing God. That's what's going to fuel faith. And therefore, logically implied in that question is, I do seek Him. Above anything else, in this life or on this planet, I seek God by faith. I draw near to God. I don't draw back. This will be most evident in doubtful and or painful seasons of life. Do you have faith? It's a question I ask myself with you. You might say, yeah, but not as strong as I would like it to be. Okay, God can work with that. That's fine. You might say, yes, I have faith, but it's not as consistent as I wish it was. Fine. You're saying it's flawed. You're in good company. God can work with you and me if we'll be honest with our doubts and bring them to Him in faith, knowing He exists and knowing that He will reward those who seek Him, even if He rewards us with energy for another day of faith. You know, Jesus was here doing ministry, and a father brought him his son who had been demon-possessed from a young age. And this father came to Jesus and says in Mark 9, many times this spirit has thrown him into the fire or the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. Jesus said to him, if you can, with raised eyebrow, I'm sure, if you can, everything is possible for the one who believes. Because anything is possible for God, and God rewards the one who believes. Immediately the father of the boy cried out, I do believe. Help my unbelief. And that's something we can cry out to when we find that our faith journey is flawed with doubt. That's what an immature faith looks like. It believes, but it needs help. If we have a belief that needs help, that's okay. God can help. But we better receive the help. What are we going to feed on? What are we digesting? The feed through the socials, the media, society or circumstances, or are we feeding on the promises of God? He'll help. But we better receive that help. We need to be growing people, or we'll be shrinking, drawing back. And we don't want to do that. You know, when we preach on Sunday, we aim to do several things. One of them is not to fill this room with hot air. We want to convince you, challenge you, convict you, encourage you, inspire you, grow you. And of course, the Holy Spirit is the enabler of all that and more. But in this series, your faith is in view. So is mine. Are we growing people in this regard. And what is more and more apparent as we study this hall of faith in Hebrews 11 is it may as well be called the hall of flaws. These are not glorified demigods of the Old Testament. These are people just like us, flawed, through whom God chose to do great things. Do we believe God can choose us to do great things? He sure can. The person from the Hall of Faith we're bringing into view today is Sarah. Sarah is Abraham's wife. I find it remarkable Sarah is in this Hall of Faith. I think Sarah too would laugh if she knew she was in this Hall of Faith. I find it remarkable she shows up, not because of some feminist sexist thing. Let's talk about sex, baby. Good idea. She shows up not because of sex, but because of faith. Faith alone. Look at what we read about her. By faith, even Sarah herself, when she was unable to have children, received power to conceive offspring, even though she was past the age, since she considered that the one who had promised was faithful. Friends, that's a really kind assessment of Sarah. You might be thinking, well, that sounds like a faithful woman right there. And that's my point. It is right there, presented as an amazing woman of faith. But that gives testament and emphasizes God's grace to cover her flaws. And He will do that for us if we trust Him. His grace is sufficient. We know, reading through the Old Testament, Sarah struggled with faith. I think at times we might all say, she's not alone. We see in the Old Testament, Sarah tried to bring about God's promises in her own strength. I think we'd probably say, you're not alone, Sarah. She tried a DIY blessing, helping God just come through on that promise that she'd waited for. She didn't wait patiently. She waited long enough and then acted. And I think we might be able to say, yeah, you're still not alone, Sarah. Who is this Sarah, who in many ways is like us? Sarah is Abraham's wife. Abraham is the father of our faith. He's the father of God's chosen people, Israel. Sarah and Abraham are God-given names. When they first show up in our Bible, their names are Sarai and Abram. We see in Genesis 11, we read a genealogy that flows all the way to Abram, and we read in verse 29 of that chapter, Abram and his brother took wives. Abram's wife was named Sarai. The very next verse, we read, Sarai was unable to conceive. She did not have a child. How do you like that for an identifying marker of you? That's who you are. Presented to the world as the one incapable of bearing children. That's who you are. But God. Now, I'll use those words this morning, my ears pricked up. But God. What is it that the world is identifying you can't do, or you can't be, or you're not capable of? But God can change everything if we will have faith. At the beginning of the very next chapter, chapter 12, we see God call Abram. He says, Go from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. So, okay, this old couple, Abram and his wife, identified as barren, that's who she is now going to be the nucleus of a nation. What do you need to have a nation? You need to have land, and you need to have lineage. God was calling them to a land. But how on earth were they going to fill that land with the lineage of a barren womb? Nevertheless, they set out on this epic journey you can read all about from Genesis chapter 12 onwards. A couple of really eventful years go by. They move from place to place, escaping famine in Canaan, escaping possible death in Egypt. A couple of years go by, still no baby. Eventually, a frustrated Abram cries out to God and says essentially in chapter 15, God, I'm old, my wife is old and barren. You know all about that. You've given us no son. The closest thing in my household is a slave named Eliezer. If I don't have a child, which we can't, do I need to remind you, God? Eliezer, my slave, will be my heir. Your promise won't come to pass. I will have no offspring. It's the end of a nation before it's birthed. To which God responds in verse 4 as a patient, loving father. Eliezer will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. Impossible. He's old, she's barren. It's not going to happen. So what does Abram do? Abram does something that many of us would do, something really human. He talks to his wife, figures out how this promise might happen. They can make it happen. You can grow a church without the Holy Spirit. You can make that happen. You can pour money into programs, and you can have people making disciples of themselves instead of Christ, and start a huge club. Sing religious songs if you want. And you can have a baby without a promise. All you need is a slave named Hagar. So that's what they did. And the baby born to Hagar was named Ishmael. He was not the product of the promise of God to Abram. He was the product of impatience. Sarai and Abram took matters into their own hands rather than trust God at His word, and it cost them dearly. You know, when we're in relationship with God and we start to realize He's got a call and a purpose on our lives, and He's not just like, see you in heaven, but He's actually walking with us into good works that He's planned in advance for us to do, and He cares about our daily going on. Whatever that purpose is, whether it's to get married and have kids, whether it's to stay single and serve others, whether it's to earn a lot of money and give generously, or to shun the pursuit of money and serve faithfully, whatever it is, the pursuit of a boyfriend or a girlfriend or an education or a career or millions of any other things that we could pursue. With all matters of Christian life, there's always going to be a choice that we face. And that is whether we have faith in God's way or our way. Wasn't that the choice for Adam and Eve in the garden? God said this, but you can do that, and you can be like God. Go your own way. Whenever we don't take God's way, the route is always possibly longer, maybe more direct, but it ends in catastrophe and ultimate destruction. God's way often looks scary. It often looks dangerous, a low percentage play. Like we stand to risk losing far more than there is to gain. We don't see what there is to gain. God's way looks like a dead end, often. Ask Moses on the shore of the Red Sea. Doesn't look good, God's way. On the other hand, our way always looks like a sure bet, right? We know better. We can see it. It's right there. If we do this, and that, we'll get there. Don't be fooled. God's way is the only way to travel. Rebellion is a long route, and there are consequences. There were for Sarah, there will be for us. You know, some people prefer flying, not to fly in airplanes, so much so that they will drive great distances because they're not in control. I was a flight attendant for 20 years. The biggest problem people have is they're not in the cockpit. They're in the cabin. Like they could do anything if they were. There's businessmen that drive coast to coast in America to meetings because they don't want to fly and not be in control. But their feelings are misled because the data tells us you're 7 times safer in the air than on the road. A school bus with 27 students this week found out when the bus careered down an embankment and rolled. Fortunately, none were killed. That was on the Western Highway this week. Fortunately, they're okay, but the truth is, hopping into a steel tube, going 1,000 k's an hour at 35,000 feet altitude is far safer than being in a vehicle that never leaves the road. It might look and feel and sound unsafe, but it's far safer. And that's so often like the will of God. Sometimes when we just trust God, it feels crazy, scary, foolish. You'll be charged with irresponsibility because we'd rather walk by sight than faith, actually. It's in our nature. We feel it's easier. But the safest way to navigate through our lives is when we step away from the vehicle and board the plane of God's will. Oh, we'll need our seatbelts though. It's wild. There's weather ahead, always. But He'll take you to heights you can't even fathom. And you'll see things in that life that you could never glance out of a vehicle on the road. Isaiah 40:31 carries me through many of those turbulent times. Those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not become weary. They will walk and not faint. Sarah and Abraham didn't trust the Lord. They crash landed. Their family life came to a place of turmoil. Their actions ended in anguish. And it split them. The 6-cylinder bomb of their own devices was blowing black smoke along the highway of their will, basically. Look at this. In chapter 16, Abram's wife Sarai had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, "Since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps through her I can build a family." And Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So Abram's wife, Sarai, took Hagar and her Egyptian slave and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years. He slept with Hagar and she became pregnant. A counterfeit is a fake. something forged. It's made to look like the real thing, but it's not. Sarah and Abraham were to forge the answer to the promise of God in their life. They were trying to make something look like the right thing, the real thing, but it wasn't. Now, before we go too hard on them, we read here in verse 3, they'd lived in the land 10 years. So at least they've waited 10 years for this promise. Anyone waited 10 years for a promise? I don't imagine anyone here is under 20, but they're all away on camp at the moment. But to our youth, this is more than half their life. If you told them God would promise to do something in their lives and they've now waited more than half their life, I think they'd get a little discouraged. I think they'd get a little impatient, like us. And so if God's not going to make it come to pass, we'll just have to help him along, do something on his behalf even. That's what's happening here with Sarah. Remember, this is a hall of faither. In Hebrews, her name's up in lights. Let's assume the best of her, though. We'll give her the benefit of the doubt. Like her and Abe were hanging around their tent eating hummus and tabbouleh and all those beautiful things, snack packs maybe these days. But she says, Abe, baby, I know you're really hooked on this idea of having this child. I mean, you're convinced God said this is what had to happen, aren't you, honey? Like, you know, it's been a long time now. I'm 75 years old, and every time I'm a little unwell, you want me to pee on that stick. I don't know what that thing is for, but where'd you get that ritual anyway? Anyway, honey, I know that you believe it's meant to happen because God told you. But let me ask you, what did God say exactly? Like, what were his exact words? Oh yeah, it was crystal clear. He just said, you know, that I'm going to definitely have a baby from my own body. Did he mention anything about my body? No. Okay. Well, baby, remember when we were in Egypt and we actually left there because God intervened and we were richer when we left than when we came because they gave us all that stuff? Yeah. Well, baby, what they gave me was a slave named Hagar. I own Hagar. Anything she produces, I own. You can sleep with her, and I will own that too. So she can bear you a child from your body in accordance with God's promise. Verse 2 says, Abram agreed to what Sarai said. Bad idea. Not always a bad idea to disagree with your wife or agree with your wife. But it's a bad idea to agree with anyone encouraging you not to wait on the Lord. That's a bad idea. Wait for the promise. The promise is always worth it. And the timing is always right. Verse 4, he slept with Hagar and she became pregnant. When she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress became contemptible to her. Sarah's plan to push God's promise made a mess of her household and a mess of her life. But God is a gracious God, you see. God's a covenant-keeping God, you see. And God's covenant keeping depends on him. It has to, otherwise he couldn't keep it. If he was depending on us to keep his promises, as in we had a part in playing to keep the promises of God, nothing would get done in accordance with his will. At God's appointed time, he visited Abraham's tent to inform him that Sarah would actually give birth to a son from her womb in a year's time. Genesis 18, the Lord asked Abraham. When he said this, Sarah laughed. The Lord said, "Why did Sarah laugh? Saying, 'Can I really have a baby when I'm old?' Is anything impossible for the Lord? At the appointed time I will come back to you, and in about a year she will have a son." Sarah denied it. "I did not laugh," she said, because she was afraid. But he, the Lord, replied, "No, you did laugh." Do you see what I see here? Sarah's coming awake. Sarah's coming awake to the fact that this is a divine promise. She's now retracting her distrust. She laughed. She thought it couldn't happen. When God said, "Why did you laugh?" she said, "I didn't." She's retracting her faithlessness, her flawed faith, albeit with an attempted lie to God, so that's not really good, but she's got work. She's got flaws, just like us. But there seems to now be a maturity in the spirit that says, God's promises are not a joke. And the beautiful outcome, assured in chapter 21, the Lord came to Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah what he had promised. Sarah became pregnant and bore a son to Abraham in his old age, at the appointed time God had told him. Abraham named him son who was born to him. The one Sarah bore to him, the child of the promise, Isaac. The birth of a nation through a 90-year-old barren womb. Is there anything our God cannot do? Through people like Sarah or people like us, flawed people of faith. Let's pray.